Come out of the world, oh my people, seek the truth, avoid the evil, learn Yahweh's ways, Torah Life Ministries.
Hello everybody, it's Paul Neeson with Torah Life Ministries, and we're going to be doing this week's Torah portion, and this week's Torah portion comes from Exodus, and it's Exodus 21:1 to 24:18, and it starts off with many different commands or guidelines that Yahweh's given, and you know there are curses that are attached to disbelief or disobeying, and there are blessings that are attached to belief and obeying. And there are many commandments given this week, and 53 to be exact, and that follows the 10 that were given last week that we saw, and there are going to be many more in the future. And some people out there might say, well, we're not accountable, we can't hold all these commandments and we can't do all the commandments. Well, you're right, you know, but the good thing is we don't have to. Some of them are not for us. Some of them are for the priests, some of them are for the temple worship, and some of them are for all different reasons. But the commandments that we are able to do and held accountable for, we have to not ignore them and we have to do them. And there are many given here and many in life in general that we are held accountable for. There's no one that is excluded from any of the commandments just because they think they can't keep them. No, regardless of what you think, you try your hardest to keep the ones that are applicable to you, and you enjoy the blessings that come along with them. And we're going to look at these here blessings that come along with many of these commandments, and understand, everybody, it's not a matter of salvation. You're not saved by works, but if you're truly saved, you should have every desire in your heart to do the works, and that's where the blessings come along with. But you have to know Torah, everybody. You have to understand what Torah says, and you have to understand Torah to understand the message of Yeshua and ultimately the message of Yahweh. And if you don't know Torah, you're going to be confused like so many people in the church today, because they don't understand the foundation of the book that Yeshua himself taught about. Now, Paul, he knew Torah. He was a Torah scholar. And we're going to see something very interesting. We're going to forward over a little here this week. We're going to go forward real quick because it has to do with this week's Torah. But we're going to see how much Paul knew Torah, because there's a lot of people today that try to teach that Paul wasn't teaching a message of Yeshua. Well, he certainly was, and it doesn't counteract his message. He was teaching a message that went right along with Yeshua's writings and what Yahweh wanted. And the only people that are going to think it seemed different are people that haven't checked Torah to see the inside of it. Because Yeshua was teaching Torah, and Paul was a Torah scholar teaching Torah. And, you know, we have to understand that. Now it says, you know, Paul brought the Torah, or he was told to bring the good news to a people other than the Jewish people, you know, so he might have changed the tone or the way he brought the message out, but in no way was he doing away with Torah. So let's look here and just get an idea from this week's Torah Parsha how well Paul knew Torah. If we forward to Acts, we could forward to Acts. We see here in Acts 23:5. You know what led up to this here. Paul was being condemned for something that he didn't do, and he was brought in front of the rulers of the land. And he said to the rulers, "How dare you bring me here without a trial? How dare you do this to me?" And they actually struck him. They smut him in the face. They smacked him in the face. And they said, "Don't talk to a ruler that way," because he was out there and he was talking to the leader that way. But he said, "I'm sorry, I did not realize he was a high priest," Paul replied. "For the scriptures say you must not speak evil of any of your rulers." Now, where does it say that in the scriptures? That's this week's Torah, everybody. If we go to Exodus 22:27, it says, "You are not to curse Yahweh, and you are not to curse a leader of your people." So Paul knew the Torah, and he was quoting it here. That's why I wanted to talk about this. Now, why didn't Paul recognize that this man was a priest, or, you know, supposedly a ruler of the land? Because that man wasn't keeping Torah. You see, it says here that Paul didn't recognize Ananias as a high priest, because it says in the scriptures, it says in Deuteronomy 19:15, "You must not convict anyone of a crime on the testimony of only one witness. All the facts of the case must be established." And here they were trying to convict Paul. So Paul, whose eyesight wasn't that great, you know, had to go off other ways to see people or to know things. And he said, well, if that man was truly a priest of Yahweh, he would be keeping Torah. And Paul knew Torah said not only to talk bad about the rules as it does in this week's Torah Portia, but it also says in Deuteronomy 19:15 that you are not to convict me without having more than one witness. And that's what they were trying to do to him. So Paul knew Torah, and the people at that time didn't. And that's one of the problems we have going on today. For us that know Torah, the people that don't are calling us legalistic and everything else. But no, we're being obedient to the scriptures. And if you really want to get the blessings that come along with accepting Yeshua as Messiah, you want to follow these. Now we're going to look further here, and we're going to look at some more things this week in this week's Torah. We're going to look at this one is Exodus 23:2. Exodus 23:2 is very interesting because it reminds me what's going on today with the church. And Exodus 23:2 says, "Do not follow the crowd when it does what is wrong." Do not follow a crowd when it does what is wrong. And, I might seem like I'm speaking against the church a lot, because I am, because the church is not doing what's right. They're not following the scriptures. I'm not saying every church out there is misled or deceived, but I am saying most of the churches, and usually the bigger the church or the more popular the church, the more they're led away by pagan doctrines and they're not following what scripture says. And there's a warning here in Exodus, and the warning is, do not follow the crowd when it does what is wrong. So we can't do that, but that's what's happening today. There are a lot of things. I'll give you a great example. You look at, the holy days in Scripture, but man today is following the Hallmark holidays. And do not follow a crowd when it does what is wrong, because then you're doing what's wrong also. It reminds me of the Scripture in Proverbs that it says, do not carouse with drunkards or feast with gluttons. Because if you overeat, if you eat with people that are overeating, guess what you're probably going to end up doing? So not only is it to not follow the crowd, because you end up being part of that crowd, and eventually it's just a matter of time before you succumb and end up doing what they do. So one of the warnings to the people that Yahweh gave Moses to tell them was, tell them not to follow the crowd when it does what is wrong. So, and it also says, goes on to say, don't let the popular views to sway your opinion, because that will pervert justice. That goes on to say there in 23:2 of Exodus. So we want to make sure not only are we not following the popular crowd, but we're also not being swayed by the popular opinion of the land. And again, this is a big problem we have today. And the more I try to teach people about what the scriptures say, and I say, read it for yourself, man, it's right there. People are running around saying, no, that's not what my preacher teaches. And, well, that's like from the health part of things, listening to a doctor just because they have a degree in the wall, where most doctors, they don't have cure for diseases, they're just controlling diseases, while the people that have cure for diseases aren't as popular, so people aren't listening to them. Basically, it comes down to this, folks. What right is not always popular, and what's popular is not always right. There it is. The next thing is a very powerful verse here, and the next thing I want to talk about in this week's Torah Portia is Exodus 23:13. Now 23:13 is placed here in 13, but I have another scriptures which actually puts the scriptures in a better order. And it actually puts 23:13 after 23:19, which is the next verse we're going to look at. So we'll look at that in a second, but right now we look at Exodus 23:13, which says, pay attention to everything I have said. Do not invoke the names of other Elohim, or even let them be heard across your lips. So this was a warning saying that we have to pay attention to every single thing Yahweh told Moses to tell the people, and do not, one of the things he pointed out was, do not invoke the names of other gods upon their lips. And there are so many people today saying the names of many different gods of this world, while they don't even say the name of our Creator Yahweh. And again, many curses come along with disobeying our Creator. And he specifically said this here. Now this was placed here right when he was giving these commands and these 53 rulings of this week's Torah Portia. He said, pay attention to everything that I have said to you, and do not invoke the names of other gods or even let them be heard crossing your lips. So that's what he said. But then we look at what the next phrase, or they kind of switch focus after they give the rulings, and then they start talking about the rulings for the feast. And it's 3 times when a man is commanded to go up to Israel a year. And it talks about this here. It talks about these 3 times here in Exodus 23:14, and it gets into them. But then at the end of it, I'm always looking for, and I have a new teaching now on food and diet and the scriptures, and scriptures that are usually taken out of context or misunderstood according to Scripture. And one of those scriptures this week that we're going to look at that so many people get confused about is, from a diet standpoint or health standpoint, is in the scripture that's found in 23:19, which says, "You are not to boil a young animal in its mother's milk." First of all, who would want to do that? But what is the actual reasoning behind that, or what's the command? Now, the Orthodox Jewish people, and this just gives you an idea why Yeshua had such a problem with them. I mean, one of the things the Orthodox Jewish people do is never to eat meat and milk together because of this command right here. But guess what? It has nothing to do with diet. Just like most of the scriptures that mention food have very little to do with diet. There's a different reason behind it, and it's the same thing here. But the Orthodox community, they're just adding to the word, and that's one of the problems, because in the scripture it says, "Do not add or subtract from the world," but that's what they were doing. They were adding to the word. But what actually does this scripture mean? Well, we saw here in Exodus 23:14. They were giving the 3 times of the year and the instructions that came along with these special feast days. And one of the reasons they were given this instruction during these feast days, and one of the things it's giving here in Exodus 23:19 says, "You are to bring the best first fruits of your land into the house of Yahweh your Creator." And then it says in the same verse, it says, "You are not to boil a young animal in its mother's milk." And the reason why it says that is because during that time, there was a pagan festival, and the pagans of that era had a fertility rite. And what they did was, it involved boiling a kid or a baby goat in its mother's milk. And what they did with that milk then was they sprinkled it over the land in hopeful to increase the yield of their crop the following season. So this was this fertility, or this custom of the pagans. It's actually of the Canaanites in the Canaanite land, and this is what they used to do. So here Yahweh is telling Moses to tell them, whatever they do, make sure, especially during these feast times, they don't mimic the customs or the ways of the heathen of the land. And he's warning them not to do that. So that's what this has to do, everybody. That's what this scripture has to do with. But we spoke before here about Exodus 23:13, because if we place it in its correct order, we would see it coming after Exodus 23:19. So it would go on to list all the rulings as we see here in this week's Torah. Then it would go on to talk about the feast days, and then finally, after it says you are to bring the best of the first fruits into your land, into the house of Yahweh, you are not to boil a young goat in its mother's milk. But then it goes on to say, pay attention to everything I have said, and do not invoke the names of other Elohim, or let them even be heard upon your lips. And that's how that ends here in this week's Torah portion with Exodus 23:19 from that area. But the actual Torah portion doesn't end until Exodus 24:18. And I will submit to you that this next part that I'm going to be reading is probably one of the most important parts of all of Scripture. So we want to make sure we take it seriously. And we want to take all Scripture seriously, but we want to really focus on this. And that is Exodus 23:20 goes on to say, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you on the way and to bring you to a place that I have prepared. Pay attention to him, listen to him, and do what he says, and do not rebel against him, because he will not forgive any wrongdoings of yours, since my name resides in him. Since my name resides in him. And guess what, folks? This angel is Yeshua. And Yeshua means Yahweh's salvation. So he's saying here he's going to send an angel ahead of us to guard our ways, and do not mock him, do not disobey him. That angel is Yeshua Messiah. And he went to the Jewish people, and many of them followed him. But many of them didn't listen to this area. After saying, we will do everything you said to do, they said it right here in this week's Torah portion. We will do everything that Yahweh has told us to do. And then here he says, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you on the way and to bring you to a place that I have prepared. And it says, pay attention to him and listen to him. But the people didn't listen to him. You know, he would have forgave their wrongdoing. The grace that comes along with Yeshua Messiah. He's forgiveness. He forgives their wrongdoing. He gives them a new heart. But they didn't listen. And that's one of the problems. And it goes on to say, you are not to worship the pagan gods. And it goes on to say, you are to demolish them completely. Do not follow their practices. Do not follow their practices. So it says this here in Exodus 23:24, you are not to worship their gods or follow their practices. And then when we go back to Exodus 23:19, it says you are not to boil a young animal in its mother's milk, because that was one of their practices. You see, many people get confused by this scripture, and they look at the Orthodox community not eating milk and meat and milk together, but they don't understand where that came from, but they think it must mean something because they're doing it, but it means nothing because they just added to the word, which we're told not to do. So you see here it says you're not to follow their practices, and that's why they were being told not to boil the kid in its mother's milk. Then we go on here to see what it says here in 23:25. You are to serve Yahweh, your creator, and he will bless your food and water. You are to serve him, and he will bless your food and water. Now, everyone that knows me out there, you know that I'm a health teacher. I teach about health. I am telling you, our food and water is cursed today. Yes, cursed. It's of the worst type, the worst quality. It's cursed more than it's ever been. And one of the strong reasons why, it says it right here. Because you are to serve Yahweh your Elohim, and he will bless your food and water. Well, what happens if you don't serve him? The opposite. If you don't serve him, your food and water will be cursed, and that's what is happening. And then it goes on, if you do follow him, it goes on to say in Exodus 23:25, I will take sickness away from among you. You know, everybody, we live in times today where we have more money, science, and knowledge of the study of disease than ever before in the history of man. But we still have more people suffering from disease than ever before in the history of man. Why? Because we have more people disobeying and living against the words of our Creator more than ever before in the history of man. That's why there is still sickness among us. Because it says here, I will take the sickness away from you if you serve and listen and obey to Yahweh your Creator. But that's not happening. So there's so much in this week's Torah portion, everyone. And every week there's so much in there. And we got to read this. We have to understand this. And we see this week one of the only two people to go into the promised land that left Egypt was Joshua. And we see here, even he didn't really understand or listen completely to Torah. Now, he had a servant's heart. And he had a heart for Yahweh. But we can be deceived because the enemy can deceive us. And we see here, we see in this week's Torah, we see the Gibeonites were a group of people that lived very close to the land. When Joshua came into the promised land and led the people into the promised land, the Gibeonites lived close. And one of the commands was Yahweh was to destroy the people that lived nearby of the heathen nature and to not make a covenant with them. It says that right here in Exodus 23:32, it says, you are not to make a covenant with them or their gods. Well, Joshua was deceived. And what happened was the Gibeonites acted as if they came from a land far away. They doctored up their clothes. We'll see this later. In Joshua 9, you could read the exact story, but the Gibeonites, they made their clothes look worn and everything else, and they came, we come from far away, because they knew, if Joshua knew that they were neighbors, they would have been destroyed. So they pretended they came from far away. And Joshua made a mistake by making a covenant with them, that he wouldn't destroy them. And it says here in the scriptures, you are not to make a covenant with them or with their gods. It doesn't say, but if you're deceived, it's okay. It says not to do that. But Joshua knew the importance of a covenant, and he knew even more important was not to break a covenant. So that's one of the reasons why it says we shouldn't make a covenant with them, because once it's made, it's set in stone, the word is bond, and it can't be broke. Well, Joshua got deceived by the Gibeonites into doing this. He did it. but he lived with it, and it caused some hardship, but you know what? It was fine because he didn't break that covenant. We have to see what it says in this week's scripture, in this week's Torah portion. In Exodus 23:32, it says, "You are not to make a covenant with them or their gods." And you know, everyone, we could relate this to today's times. We are not to come into an agreement or make a covenant with somebody who's not a believer. And a marriage contract is a covenant. A business deal is a covenant. Anytime you're agreeing to something on a real high serious level, or even if it's not a serious level, it's still a covenant. Once you give your word, you're making a covenant with somebody. And we're warned here, you are not to make a covenant with them or their gods. So anyone who's not a believer, or anyone who seeks a different lifestyle in a different way, we are commanded to, as children of Israel, not to make a covenant with them. We are commanded as believers of Messiah Yeshua not to make a covenant with them. And if we do make a covenant with them, by error or by deception, we have to be a good representative and we have to stick to our word. When Paul was in front of the priest, he didn't recognize them because they weren't being good representatives of Yeshua, because they weren't keeping Torah, so that's how he knew they weren't priests. But if they would have been keeping Torah, it doesn't matter how bad your eyesight is or how blind you are. By just hearing a person, by just knowing what they're doing, you would know if they're being obedient to Torah or not. You will know if they're good representatives of Yeshua Messiah or not. And we're called to be good representatives. And keeping our word is part of that. And also keeping the Torah is a big part of that as well. The Torah was never done away with. It means guidelines and instructions of our Creator. Within those guidelines and instructions are some commands that we're responsible for throughout all our generations. And if we keep those, major blessings come along with that. And that includes our health, our wealth, and everything else. So we all have a choice, everybody. You make the decision, but the information and the instructions of what to do is found here in the Torah. There's so much more coming up in the next readings of the Torah portion, and in the previous weeks. I recommend you go back and read them if you missed them. But you can go to TorahLife.tv and see all of the Torah portion teachings that I've done in the past, plus some great guests. And that's on TorahLife.tv. www.TorahLife.tv. And if you're interested in health, I have a podcast out now. It's called Health and Torah. And you can just go to Podomatic, www.podomatic, M-A-T-I-C, and you can see, just type in my name, Paul Neeson, or type in Health and Torah, and you'll see my podcast come up. I'm doing teachings there every week as well. Just trying to get this information out, because the scriptures say, go and make disciples, and you can't make disciples if you're not teaching the word, or you're not living the word. So, everybody, that's this week's Torah portion. I thank you for joining. And have a great Shabbat, this coming Shabbat, and we'll see you again soon on Torah Life Ministries. Thank you.
Come out of the world, oh my people, seek the truth, avoid the evil, learn